Now, you've stayed here, you listened to the first plenary session when it comes to the new roadmap for in a troubled world. Now, when it comes to the troubled world, I could spend another half of the day listing all the troubles and the aspects, but there's something specific that I want to focus with in our session right here. And that one is the aspect of resilience, and specifically if I have to list some of the factors that we're going to be discussing and about resilient to, that will be with the turbulent times with the significant inflation when it comes to infrastructure. Now, this is a highly timely issue to discuss here. Great to have two of you here, and hopefully we're going to have a great chat. Emmanuel, let's start with you, please. Now, when it comes to infrastructure, this asset class often presented as an inflation hedge, suggesting that the revenues of infrastructure companies are so-called indexed to inflation. Is this still the case now?
That's a very good question. Thank you. I will take one extra step back. We are talking about a very recent asset class that started in 2000s, right, Thierry? Your fund started in mid-2000s, and this was actually one of the firsts. And now is a question of the test of the resiliency is coming, because most of this asset class has been developed with low interest rates and no inflation. And now we're going to test in real life whether that stands the test.
I mean, I can complement that. I mean, in real life, I think we can confirm that the test actually works. There is a fairly good elasticity between inflation and valuation and infrastructure return. I mean, however, we haven't tested to the limits. So I'm not quite sure inflation's above 10% or even 8 to... We don't know the limits yet, right? Indeed. So we don't know whether we go to a plastic stage or whether we keep being elastic. So I think that remains to be seen. But I think it's important to mention this link. Infrastructure is based on usage, and that's why it's economically very important and very much linked to inflation and GDP. But I think to remain within this chaos, I think we have to realize that the resilience of this asset class also comes from the fact that it produces services that are essential, and essential services usage doesn't necessarily decrease during crisis. So there's a natural hedge in the infrastructure usage, and there's also all the contractual ways that infrastructure has been delivered through regulation and others that makes it quite resilient as well to crisis.
To the current one.
To all of them.
To all of them. Emmanuel, well, not all infrastructure assets are equally protected when it comes to resilience regarding inflation. What are they, and what are the type of infrastructure where the statement doesn't work in the current situation? If you could define that for us.
I think it really needs to be looked at on an ad hoc basis. It's very difficult to say this asset category will not stand the test of resilience, especially in the face of inflation. If we look at some characteristics, if you are selling directly to retail and you don't have a solid regulatory framework to actually pass on inflation, or even if you have it, but actually it's going to be hugely contentious to pass on the inflation directly, you will be in trouble. You will be in difficulties. Now, if you are on an availability payment system facing public bodies with a very solid concession in place, then you are safe, right? And this really needs to be looked at on every particular asset. And over the last 15 years, some investors had it easy, actually, to just buy an asset, feel, okay, this is all great and good, and it's easy, I'm just doing it, and I will be able to resell it. And we have seen some investors that were supposed to be in there forever, sorry, and actually have entered and exited some assets. Now we're going to see whether some of these assets have been bought on the more expensive side without looking at how they are properly protected against inflation, whether the clauses, even if they are in there, are actually implementable. And most of them, is our belief, will be protected and will be fine, but there may be instances here or there where it's going to be more difficult.
Let's talk more about those cases and when it's going to be a bit harder.
I mean, I think in both cases, you will have an obligation to actually engage, because as prices increase, even though it could be paid by government, you need to justify an excellent service. You need to justify quite a number of things. So this is where all the long-term approach of ESG engagement with government becomes very important, because when you increase the price of a public service, it's never easy, regardless of your contractual protection. Even when the government pays, you know that governments don't really have the extensive pocket, in particular this one here, that can just let them give you anything you want. So it's very important to link that sort of inflation increase and to remain resilient with a full engagement with the stakeholders of your infrastructure, regardless of who's actually paying eventually.
Emmanuel?
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah, okay, that was an easy one. But let's go into more details on the importance of infrastructure to be well designed on all the levels to, in order to stay resilient. Because again, when it comes to resilience, yes, we are focusing now during this fireside chat on specifically on this, on the aspect of inflation, but also being well designed on all the levels would mean that the resilience would stay not just for the current situation, but also for the next crisis. And this is something I tried to ask you earlier. So this is the question that I want to ask both of you, because I feel like, again, in any assessment that we're trying to make now, we focus on inflation specifically today during this chat, but also every time we make an assessment, there is a new aspect, there is a new risk, there is a new factor to keep in mind. Let's talk about the importance of design to be well made on all the levels in order to be more resilient. Thierry, do you want to start with this?
Yeah, I think that what the crisis has showed is that our systems are not necessarily resilient enough. So the investment that needs to be made is to increase that level of resilience. And I can take 3 examples. Our energy mix was not resilient enough because just the Russian gas disappearing made it a disaster. It's not just the Russian gas, but there are other factors, but that's the main one. So increasing investment to balance with other renewables and also energy-saving investments will really help that resilience. The same thing on our networks. We're not necessarily interconnected enough within Europe to be resilient enough. For example, I think today France, for example, has promised Germany to support on the gas thing, but whether we have all the pipelines necessary to do that and whether we have all the terminals for LNG to do that is another question. Well, actually, Germany doesn't have quite enough of LNG terminal. That is why they're dependent. So that's another lack of resilience. But if I also talk in a totally different sector on the logistics side, I mean, Europe has invested quite a lot in the past 3 decades in trans-European network of all sorts, but we're still lacking quite a number of relay links. When you think about energy transition, low carbon, decarbonizing the economy, and you still can't go from Paris to Berlin in a high-speed train, it's a problem. I mean, in a decent time, I mean, amount of time. So all these investments will need to be there to increase our resilience on many levels. Emmanuel.
Yeah, I would like to take it maybe through illustrations, as Thierry did, and go into certain segments. There are certain fundamentals that will always be there and that are important. If you buy an airport, the location will be key. And we have seen through the COVID crisis that actually the traffic mix has a huge impact, because if you're operating a hub airport and nobody's traveling, it's of course more difficult. But in the end, it will always catch up. And if you have point-to-point traffic, it will be great. If you have a competing airport that is of a secondary nature in a certain catchment area, it's going to be a problem. And that problem may be shown in a more stronger way when the crisis hits, but the fundamentals are just not necessarily there. It's just more risky as an investment. If I take another example, and we are talking about an asset class, infrastructure, that has extended its reach. And rightly so in many instances, because at the end of the day, when you have resilient cash flows, actually, and number of characteristics, it can qualify as infrastructure. Let's take a French example, retirement homes. Not so easy, right, in recent times. Because if you look at being in a listed company, which is not always flavor of the day for infrastructure investors, and then you look at something that hits you on the side, which is revelations about the way a certain company was managed, etc., but it hits the entire sector, it's a rough ride. But at the end of the day, the fundamentals, which are their needs, it is something that will be sorted out by dialogue with the public policymakers, because these needs are of social nature. You can't just have no retirement homes or no more development of these. And therefore, in my eyes, although today it's a very rough ride for infrastructure investors that are directly invested in these listed companies, in the end, the fundamentals are there and make it extremely resilient.
Do you want to add something?
No, I was going to talk about the retirement homes because it's a very good example. Because I think 15 years ago, a number of us tried to make this a real infrastructure asset class. But, I mean, obviously, it's been a big debate in France. And what is quite sure today is to have affordable retirement homes and services, the current system will never manage to provide this. And so whatever has happened to those companies was bound to happen because you cannot finance the real estate plus the services with the kind of money that the social security system is able to provide. So anyway, it was a failure bound to happen, and it did happen, unfortunately.
Well, from there, let me ask another question to both speakers. I'm going to bring you to this new report by the World Bank that's called Mind the Gap, Time to Rethink Infrastructure Finance, that says, while the key challenges is typically explained as one of the insufficient financing, the real issue holding infrastructure investment back is lack of investable projects in many cases. And this is a bit of a changing the table, turning those tables and changing the whole perspective. Now, these are the final question which I would like both speakers to share their thoughts about, because this is indeed not something that we necessarily talk about every time we talk about financing infrastructure projects.
I think the investable project concept is a bit of a fuzzy one because investable projects don't just appear. In fact, they become investable when people actually take care of them. So the lack and the real hurdle is the lack of skills, both on the public sector, on the regulators, and also on the private sector side. So that is really where there is a real gap, and that has been really impossible to unlock so far. And this is part of the role of the MDBs, actually, like the World Bank. They're supposed to be supporting these things, and they try to, although not with great success always. But I guess they're encouraging it. But we are moving to mobilizing more capital, especially for emerging markets, where the investable solutions are not necessarily obvious. I mean, I think one example which was mentioned this morning is the Fast Infra initiative that the One Planet Lab initiated, HSBC, at LTIA. We supported quite a lot this whole thing. One of the first sub-initiative that came out of it was the label. If you do have an easy way for people to actually label sustainable infrastructure, it'll be easier to mobilize capital markets and investors into this asset class, including in emerging markets. So you have to make it easy for investors, for the money to actually flow through to those projects. But I think we should stop thinking about there's not enough investable projects. There's not enough people to actually make projects investable, because investable projects don't fall from the sky. But the World Bank still doesn't know that. So it's like in a bigger picture
of rethinking it. Emmanuel, your take on that?
Yes, I agree with what Thierry said. I'm going to take it from another perspective. I'm pretty sure that the time of almost pure financial investors buying an asset at a multiple X and reselling it 5, 8, 10 years afterwards at multiple X plus 2 turns, that's sort of finished. And either you will have people that are differentiated because they have the capabilities to actually look at what is what makes a project investable. And I know Thierry has lots of engineers and engineering capabilities to actually understand projects. And there are other investors of that kind. But clearly not all infra investors have on board actually the ability to talk with constructors, see whether something can actually be built, challenge the cost, etc., which then makes a project investable or not, right? But at least you assess it and you say, this may be investable if we match this or that characteristic, if we amend this or that. If you are actually more of a financial nature, if you're a direct investor looking to do something, etc., you usually these days either go for listed, and that's one of the most recent trends. It's if I'm ready to buy something at 15 to 20 times, I may as well buy it listed 10 times, and nothing should happen, nothing bad should happen to me. The retirement home thing shows that actually, even if when you're a listed company, it's actually not that easy. But anyway, I don't want to overblow that. So that's one way to go, or you go with a platform. You actually hand the keys to a management that will do. You better be good at buying the first asset, and then they will develop it. They will bring things. We have run a process this summer and helped Infraweek exit a port storage play called Alkion. And actually, without betraying everything that was in the process, there was a very healthy level of appetite. Most of the buyers were actually strategics backed by financial investors, because that is sort of a winning formula. If you don't have the capabilities on board, then you better make sure that you have a management that is actually knowledgeable about a certain segment.
That always helps, right? So thank you so much. That's Thierry, DEAU founder and CEO at Meridiam, and Emmanuel GOLDSTEIN, managing director, country head and CEO of Morgan Stanley France, head of EMEA transportation and infrastructure. Thank you to both of you very much.